Hey there, welcome to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into the extraordinary story of one of the most powerful and mysterious civilizations in human history, the Aztecs. From their rise in the highlands of central Mexico to their dramatic and tragic fall at the hands of foreign invaders. This is a journey through time, legend, and legacy. If you're listening right now, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below, and if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and ensures you won't miss our next relaxing deep dive into history. Let's begin. Long before the Aztecs dominated the Valley of Mexico, this lush and complex region had been home to numerous cultures. The valley, encircled by mountains and blessed with lakes and fertile soil, became the stage upon which multiple ancient civilizations rose and fell. One of the most influential among them was Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan, whose name means the place where gods were born, was a massive urban center that flourished from about 100 BCE to 550 CE. With its awe-inspiring pyramids, grand avenues, and rich ceremonial life, Teotihuacan was not just a city, it was a symbol of power, trade, and culture. Though the people of Teotihuacan were long gone by the time the Aztecs rose, their legacy left a profound mark on the architecture, religion, and myths of their successors. Following Teotihuacan's mysterious collapse, the Toltecs rose to prominence. The Toltec capital of Tula was a blend of militarism and artistry. The Aztecs would later claim lineage from the Toltecs, idolizing them as sages and warriors of an ideal past. When the Aztecs first arrived in the Valley of Mexico in the 13th century, they were not yet a mighty people. In fact, they were migrants, nomads from the north, possibly from a mythical homeland known as Aztlan. According to their own accounts, they wandered for generations under divine guidance until they received a sign from their god, Huitzilopochtli, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. This was where they were to build their city. At first, they were scorned and marginalized by the more established city-states in the valley. The Aztecs were forced to settle in less desirable areas, like swampy islands on Lake Texcoco. Yet what others saw as a disadvantage, the Aztecs turned into an opportunity. Using chinampas, ingenious floating gardens, they transformed the marshy terrain into productive agricultural land. Over time, their city, Tenochtitlan, grew in wealth, power, and ambition. But the rise of the Aztecs was not inevitable. It was a result of clever alliances, calculated warfare, religious fervor, and a complex web of tribute and trade that spanned Mesoamerica. In the next section, we'll explore how the Aztecs forged a military alliance known as the Triple Alliance, how they came to dominate their neighbors, and how Tenochtitlan became a city of wonders. The Aztecs' transformation from marginalized migrants to imperial rulers was neither swift nor easy. It unfolded over a century of strategic decisions, religious ideology, and relentless ambition, culminating in the birth of one of the most formidable empires in the Americas. At the center of it all stood Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which would become one of the most dazzling cities the world had ever seen. When the Mexica people, as the Aztecs called themselves, first arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they were dismissed as uncultured and uncivilized. Many of the established city-states, or Altepetl, refused them land. Ultimately, the Mexica settled on a small island in the western part of Lake Texcoco, a seemingly unpromising location. But with determination and innovation, they began to reshape their surroundings. To adapt to the lake environment, the Aztecs engineered chinampas, artificial islands built by layering mud and plant matter. These floating gardens became marvels of productivity, allowing the Aztecs to grow staple crops like maize, beans, squash, and chilies. The lake not only provided fertile soil and fresh water, but also became a highway for canoes and trade. As their economy stabilized, the Aztecs turned their attention to politics and warfare. They served as mercenaries for more powerful city-states, especially Azcapotzalco, the dominant power in the region. In exchange for military support, they received goods, training, and political experience. Their martial prowess and ferocity in battle became well known and feared. But as their power grew, so did their aspirations. In 1428, a seismic shift occurred. The Aztecs, under the leadership of Itzcoatl, allied with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, to overthrow their mutual overlord, Azcapotzalco. This coalition, known as the Triple Alliance, marked the beginning of the Aztec Empire. Each member of the alliance brought unique strengths. Texcoco was a center of learning and culture, with a noble lineage and advanced governance. Tlacopan offered strategic location and additional military support, and Tenochtitlan, the rising power, brought ambition and an increasingly capable army. The alliance waged war together, divided spoils, and levied tribute from conquered peoples. Over time, Tenochtitlan emerged as the dominant partner, controlling the largest share of wealth and territory. The Aztecs had gone from outcasts to overlords. With victory came a cultural renaissance. The city of Tenochtitlan expanded rapidly. Canals crisscrossed the city, connecting neighborhoods and marketplaces. Causeways linked the island to the mainland. At the center stood the Templo Mayor, a towering double pyramid dedicated to the gods Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The temple symbolized Aztec duality, war and rain, fire and water, sacrifice and sustenance. Religion and statecraft were inseparable in Aztec society. The Aztecs believed that the universe was sustained through sacrifice, and that human hearts and blood fed the gods and ensured cosmic balance. This belief drove their imperial policy. They sought not just conquest, but captives, to feed the altars of Tenochtitlan. Tribute was another pillar of their power. Conquered regions were required to deliver textiles, food, luxury items, and slaves. A vast bureaucracy managed this system, with records meticulously kept in pictographic codices. Markets in Tenochtitlan bustled with goods from across Mesoamerica: jade from the south, obsidian from the highlands, cacao, feathers, rubber, and gold. The emperor, or Huitlacoani, literally the Great Speaker, was both a political and spiritual leader. Itzcoatl laid the foundation, But his successors, Moctezuma I's, Axayacatl, and others, expanded the empire to its zenith. Each emperor led campaigns, commissioned grand building projects, and hosted ritual ceremonies. Education was also a hallmark of Aztec society. Boys attended schools called Telpochcali or Calmacac, depending on their social status, where they learned warfare, religion, law, and history. Girls were trained in domestic arts and rituals. Poetry, song, and philosophy flourished, especially in Texcoco, under the patronage of the philosopher king Nezahualcoyotl. Yet this empire, glorious as it was, rested on a knife's edge. Many conquered peoples resented Aztec domination. Their tribute burdens were heavy, and the constant demand for sacrificial victims instilled fear. The flower wars, ritual conflicts designed to capture rather than kill, further fueled resentment. Despite these tensions, the Aztec Empire stood unchallenged as the 15th century waned. Tenochtitlan gleamed in the sun, its temples rising from the lake, its streets filled with merchants and priests, its emperors basking in divine authority. But in the distance, ships were on the horizon, foreigners with unfamiliar weapons, beliefs, and diseases were preparing to land. The next chapter would begin not with triumph, but with an encounter that would shake the foundation of the Aztec world. To truly understand the Aztec Empire, we must look beyond its military might and urban splendor. We must step into the metaphysical world that animated every facet of Aztec life. A world where gods walked among mortals, where time moved in cycles of creation and destruction, and where blood was the sacred glue that held the cosmos together. The Aztecs were not merely warriors or empire builders. They were theologians, philosophers, and ritualists. Their worldview was as rich and complex as the architectural marvels they constructed. It was a worldview that gave meaning to suffering, structure to society, and legitimacy to conquest. At the heart of their belief system was the idea that the universe had been created and destroyed multiple times. These cosmic epochs, known as suns, each ended in cataclysm. The Aztecs believed. They were living in the era of the fifth sun, a fragile age that could end at any moment if not properly sustained. What sustained the fifth sun? The answer to the Aztecs was sacrifice. They believed that the gods themselves had made profound sacrifices to create the world. Most notably, in their myth of cosmic creation, the gods gathered at Teotihuacan and offered themselves in fire to become the sun and moon. One god leapt boldly into the flames, while another hesitated, then followed in shame. From this act of divine self-sacrifice emerged the celestial bodies. But the sun, newly born, would not move across the sky unless it was nourished with blood. Thus, sacrifice was not cruelty. It was duty. It was repayment for the debt humanity owed to the gods. Every drop of blood spilled on the steps of the Templo Mayor was, in the eyes of the Aztecs, an act of cosmic balance. This belief permeated every level of Aztec society. Religious festivals, which filled the calendar, often included human offerings. Some victims were volunteers, honored and fed for months before their ritual death. Others were war captives, paraded and sacrificed in spectacular ceremonies that combined music, dance, and pageantry. One of the most significant ceremonies was the Panquetzalistli festival, honoring Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. This god was central to the Mexica identity. According to myth, Huitzilopochtli was born fully armed from his mother Coatlicue's womb and immediately slaughtered his siblings to protect her. His divine narrative reflected the Aztecs' own emergence, armed, aggressive, and chosen. The priests, known as Tlamacazque, wielded great authority. Dressed in intricate costumes and trained from childhood, they performed complex rituals, interpreted omens, and maintained the temple fires. They were guardians of the sacred calendar, a 260-day cycle called the Tonalpohualli, used for divination, along with the Xupohualli, a 365-day agricultural calendar. These dual calendars created an intricate rhythm of time, dictating auspicious days for farming, warfare, birth, and sacrifice. Each day was ruled by specific gods, numbers, and symbols. Life was not linear. It was a spiral dance of fate and repetition. Education, too, reinforced the cosmic order. Children learned mythology, ethics, and ritual songs. Even the warriors, often seen as mere fighters, understood their role in cosmic preservation. When they captured prisoners, they were not just bringing trophies. They were gathering divine fuel for the sun. In this way, warfare itself became ritualized. The so-called flower wars were pre-arranged conflicts between city-states like Tlaxcala and Tenochtitlan. These battles were not fought for territory, but for captives, individuals to be sacrificed in the temples. This practice had the dual effect of honing military skill and supplying the temples with blood. While this might sound alien or horrifying today, it is essential to avoid simplistic moral judgments. The Aztec system, as brutal as it was built upon a deep sense of order, reciprocity, and the sacred. Even their architecture reflected their theology. The Templo Mayor, the heart of Tenochtitlan, was not just a temple, it was a cosmogram. Its two shrines, one for Huitzilopochtli, the other for Tlaloc, the rain god, represented the dual forces of war and fertility. The temple was aligned with celestial events, and its base was decorated with serpents and skulls, symbolizing the earth's appetite for life. Rituals within the temple were elaborate. Victims were led up the steep stairs, their hearts cut out with obsidian knives and offered to the gods. Their bodies might be thrown down the steps, decapitated, or dismembered, then ceremonially buried or displayed. These scenes, though chilling to modern eyes, were moments of cosmic significance. Not all Aztec rituals involved death. There were rites for childbirth, harvest, marriages, and purification. Offerings of maize, feathers, jade, and incense were common. Music, poetry, and dance were considered sacred expressions. The Aztecs composed flower songs, metaphorical poems that explored the fleeting nature of life, the search for truth, and the yearning for divine understanding. Philosophy thrived alongside ritual. The Aztecs contemplated the nature of in Xochitl, in Cuauhtémoc, flower and song, as symbols of beauty, truth, and ephemeral existence. Life was precious because it was temporary. This belief was not unlike the Buddhist idea of impermanence or the Stoic concept of memento mori. Society was deeply stratified, but not static. Commoners could rise through military achievement or exceptional service. The nobility, or pipiltin, were expected to lead, fight, and sacrifice. The emperor, as the Cuauhtémoc, was chosen from noble blood, but was not a monarch by birthright alone. He had to earn the gods' favor and the people's respect. Women held crucial roles, especially in domestic rituals, childbirth ceremonies, and textile production. Midwives were revered, and mothers who died in childbirth were honored as fallen warriors. All of this, the war, the poetry, the ritual, the philosophy, was woven into the tapestry of Aztec identity. They saw themselves not as cruel rulers, but as caretakers of the sun, guardians of balance, and stewards of a sacred, dangerous world. Yet this worldview had consequences. It required a constant influx of captives and tribute. It made enemies of former allies, and it led to a brittle dependence on cosmic favor, a belief that could be shattered when foreign gods and steel-wielding men arrived from across the sea. The Spanish would not just bring swords and muskets, they would bring a different mythology, a rival religion, and a worldview that could not be reconciled with the Aztec vision of the cosmos. The empire, for all its glory, was built on a foundation of cosmic tension, and as the 16th century dawned, the tension would soon give way to rupture. The Aztec belief in cosmic debt and sacrificial necessity was not just religious doctrine, it was the very engine of their imperial expansion. Every campaign, every war, every tribute demanded was justified not merely by ambition or greed, but by cosmic necessity. To fail to appease the gods was to invite catastrophe not just upon Tenochtitlan, but upon the entire world. This worldview hardened the Aztecs' stance toward rebellion and resistance. For them, a rebellious province was not just a political inconvenience. It was a threat to the sun's journey, to rain, to harvests, to the survival of life itself. Thus, the Aztec military machine grew ever more ferocious and their policies more demanding. But this religious military symbiosis had unintended consequences. As the empire expanded, so did the number of enemies. The tributary demands grew heavier, especially on smaller city-states. Cloth, cacao, feathers, rubber, maize, obsidian, jade, and even human beings were extracted in enormous quantities. This extraction fueled Tenochtitlan's splendor, but also stoked resentment. The regions of Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and others never submitted fully to Aztec domination. Though surrounded by Aztec allies and subject states, they retained independence through fierce resistance and their strategic value. These city-states would later play a pivotal role in the downfall of the empire, but in the early 1500s, they were seen as manageable thorns, not existential threats. Meanwhile, omens began to appear, at least according to later Aztec records. Bright lights in the sky, the spontaneous burning of temples, mysterious voices in the night, the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, long prophesied to return from the east, loomed large in the imagination of priests and rulers alike. Some modern scholars believe these stories were retroactive myth-making, narratives constructed after the Spanish conquest to make sense of the collapse. Others argue that unusual astronomical events and cultural anxieties were very real and did create a sense of foreboding. Either way, as the final years of the Aztec Empire approached, the tension was palpable. The spiritual burden of sustaining the cosmos, the political strain of managing an enormous tribute system, and the military pressure of constant campaigning were converging. Then came the reign of Moctezuma II, a ruler of contradictions. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin was well-educated, pious, and steeped in religious tradition. He expanded the empire further than any before him, yet he ruled with increasing paranoia. He relied heavily on omens and diviners. His rule saw grand construction projects and elaborate ceremonies, but also a growing unease among the nobility and military. When Moctezuma received word that pale-skinned men had landed on the eastern shores, men with metal, beasts, and thundersticks, he was not dismissive. He sent emissaries bearing gifts, hoping to appease or understand them. Among those visitors was Hernán Cortés. The Spanish, driven by gold, conquest, and religious zeal, were about to meet the Aztecs, a civilization with its own spiritual mandate, its own divine destiny. Two empires, two gods, two visions of the world on a collision course. But for all their power, the Aztecs would soon discover that cosmic balance could be undone not by gods, but by germs, greed, and gunpowder. In the year 1519, a new force entered the Valley of Mexico, one unlike anything the Aztecs had ever seen. From the east, across the Great Gulf, came men clad in shimmering armor, wielding steel and fire, riding strange beasts with eyes full of hunger. They came with banners of red and gold, with swords that rang like thunder, and a language that was harsh and commanding. They came from a world where gods were born from different myths, where sacrifice was condemned and gold revered above blood. They came from Spain. Hernán Cortés, a man of restless ambition and ruthless resolve, had sailed from Cuba with a small fleet of ships and fewer than 600 men. On paper, he had no right to victory. He was outnumbered, far from home, with limited supplies. Yet what he lacked in numbers, he compensated for with cunning, charisma, and a profound ability to exploit division. He quickly understood that the Aztec Empire was not a monolithic force, but a web of resentment, tribute, and unrest. The coastal peoples, Totonacs, Tlaxcalans, and others, had long suffered under Aztec demands. When Cortés offered alliance, they listened. He offered them not just freedom from tribute, but vengeance. And he offered gifts, shiny trinkets and displays of power that both intrigued and terrified the local rulers. To many indigenous leaders, the Spaniards seemed to possess the power of gods. They brought unknown diseases, fired weapons that belched smoke and death, and carried crosses that they claimed were divine. As the Spanish advanced inland, they clashed with Tlaxcala, one of the fiercest independent city-states. For days, brutal battles raged, with muskets and steel pitted against obsidian and valor. Yet in a surprising turn, the Tlaxcalans, recognizing the Spaniards' potential, agreed to an alliance. It was a decision that would shape the fate of the continent. Moctezuma II, far away in Tenochtitlan, received word of these strangers with a mix of dread and reverence. According to some accounts, he believed Cortés to be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, or at least feared that others might believe so. Rather than confront the invaders with immediate force, Moctezuma chose diplomacy. He sent emissaries bearing priceless gifts, feathered cloaks, gold discs, jade ornaments. The intention was to impress, perhaps even to intimidate. Instead, it inflamed the Spaniards' lust for gold. Cortés, now bolstered by native allies, marched toward the heart of the empire. His progress was marked by blood and ceremony. He passed through cities of immense beauty, markets bustling with trade, pyramids stretching toward the heavens, murals alive with color and myth. He saw the grandeur of a civilization far older than his own. Yet he did not come to admire, he came to dominate. Upon reaching Tenochtitlan, Cortés was awestruck. The city, set upon the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, appeared to float like a dream. Wide causeways connected the island city to the mainland. Canoes glided silently beneath arched bridges. The streets were clean, orderly, filled with people in fine garments. It was a metropolis rivaling any in Europe, and perhaps surpassing them in harmony and elegance. Moctezuma received Cortés with solemn ceremony. He offered hospitality, gifts, and deference. But beneath the surface, unease festered. The Spanish were polite but watchful. They studied the city's defenses, noted the priesthood's rituals, and plotted their next move. Within weeks, Cortés took a shocking step. He seized Moctezuma, placing him under house arrest in his own palace. The act sent shockwaves through Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, the living embodiment of divine authority, was now a prisoner of foreign invaders. Yet the emperor, either paralyzed by prophecy or striving to avoid open war, complied. He continued to address his people from the palace walls, now under the gaze of foreign swords. It was a humiliation that shook the Aztec world to its core. For a time, the uneasy peace held, but tensions escalated. Spanish soldiers, appalled by human sacrifice, desecrated temples and insulted the gods. Aztec nobles bristled. The people grew restless. Then came the massacre at the festival of Toxcatl, a sacred celebration in honor of Tezcatlipoca. As dancers filled the temple with music and color, the Spaniards struck. They slaughtered unarmed celebrants in the temple courtyard, painting the stones with blood. Whether out of fear or preemptive calculation, the massacre turned a fragile peace into open war. Tenochtitlan, erupted. The people rose against the invaders. Moctezuma, now despised by his own for his submission, attempted to calm the city, but he was struck by a stone from his own subjects and soon died, either from his wounds or at Spanish hands. The details remain shrouded in mystery, but his death marked a turning point. The Spaniards, now under siege, fought their way out of the city in a harrowing retreat known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Many drowned in the canals, weighed down by stolen gold. Others were captured and sacrificed atop the very temples they had once mocked. For the Aztecs, it was a moment of triumph, but it would be short-lived. Cortés was not finished. He retreated to Tlaxcala, regrouped, and prepared for a final siege. With thousands of native allies, warships built from dismantled Spanish caravels, and a new arsenal of weapons, he would return to Tenochtitlan not as a guest, but as a conqueror. The great city of the Aztecs, once the jewel of the valley, was now the target of annihilation. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in 1521, it was with fire in his heart and fury in his army. The city he had once walked through as a guest would now be surrounded as a fortress under siege. But Tenochtitlan was not a place easily taken. Built on a lake with only narrow causeways connecting it to the mainland, it was both a natural fortress and a place of immense resilience. The Aztecs, now under the leadership of Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's young and courageous nephew, prepared to defend their city to the last. The siege was not swift. It stretched across 93 grueling days. Cortés commanded a massive alliance of tens of thousands of native warriors, many of whom had suffered under Aztec rule for decades. Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, and other long-suppressed peoples now fought alongside Spanish soldiers, wielding vengeance as their banner. Cortés also commanded brigantines, small warships built on Lake Texcoco, which cut off the city's supply lines, severing access to fresh water and food. Inside the city, conditions became dire. Disease had already arrived before the final siege. Smallpox, carried unknowingly by a single infected Spaniard, swept through the population like fire. It decimated the Aztec nobility, crippled their military, and left a trail of corpses in every neighborhood. It was a weapon Cortés had not planned, but wielded with deadly effectiveness. Cuauhtémoc fought bravely, organizing defenses, inspiring the people, and refusing surrender. Battles raged street by street, canal by canal. Spanish cannon fire tore through temples. Muskets echoed across the lake. The chinampas burned. The great markets of Tlatelolco turned into war zones. The smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the air. What was once the most majestic city in the Americas was reduced to rubble. The shimmering temples, the colorful homes, the sacred pyramids, cracked, broken, and blackened. The aqueducts that once brought clean water were shattered. Hunger gnawed at every belly. Disease twisted limbs and dimmed eyes. And still, the Aztecs resisted. Finally, On August the 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to flee across the lake. He was brought before Cortés, defiant and proud. "I have done what was my duty in defense of my city and my people," he reportedly said. "Now finish me with your dagger." But Cortés, recognizing the symbolism of his capture, spared him for the moment. The siege was over. Tenochtitlan, once the heart of an empire, now lay in ruins. A new city would rise in its place. Mexico City, the capital of a Spanish colony. But something irreplaceable had been lost. Not just stone and gold, but an entire civilization's worldview, language, rhythm, and memory. The fall of the Aztec Empire marked the beginning of a new and brutal era. Spanish priests destroyed codices, attempting to erase the native gods and rewrite history through Christian eyes. Survivors were baptized, enslaved, or driven into servitude. Yet in quiet corners, the memory of Tenochtitlan lived on. In oral stories, in whispered songs, in the rhythm of Nahuatl poetry, and the prayerful planting of maize, the spirit of the Mexica endured. The gods, perhaps, did not die. They simply transformed, just as the Aztecs had, again and again, through the fires of myth and the cycles of suns. The empire had fallen, but its legacy would ripple through time, echoing in the stones of pyramids, in the surviving codices, and in the hearts of descendants who would one day reclaim the truth of their ancestors. With the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire as a political and military force was no more. But empires do not vanish entirely in a single battle. Though the temples were toppled and the language of rulers changed, the memory of the Aztecs lingered like smoke in a ruined palace. The conquest marked not only the collision of two worlds, but the beginning of a long struggle over memory, identity, and truth. In the immediate aftermath, Hernán Cortés moved swiftly to consolidate control. He began building over the ruins of Tenochtitlan, laying out the streets of Mexico City on top of the sacred spaces of the Mexica. Spanish churches rose where temples had stood. Crosses replaced obsidian blades. But in the cracks of this imposed order, indigenous life continued. The people adapted, as they had done countless times before. The survivors of the siege, those who had not died of disease, starvation, or violence, were conscripted into labor. They built the very city that had replaced their own. The great stones of the Templo Mayor were repurposed for cathedrals. The canals were filled in, the aqueducts rerouted, the chinampas neglected. Spanish priests and friars fanned out across the land, seeking to convert, educate, and often erase. But not all was lost. Some indigenous nobility found ways to negotiate with the new regime. They retained certain privileges in return for loyalty. Nahuatl, the Aztec language, remained widely spoken for generations. The structure of Altepetl, local city-states, persisted under colonial rule. Indigenous scribes wrote new codices, combining native iconography with Latin script, preserving fragments of Aztec thought, law, and history. Yet the Spaniards wrote much of the narrative that the world would come to know. Chroniclers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo and priests like Fray Bernardino de Sahagún recorded the conquest from their perspectives, sometimes sympathetic, often distorted. They marveled at Aztec architecture, art, and poetry, but condemned their religion as demonic. The rich complexity of Aztec civilization was reduced to tales of gold, sacrifice, and savagery. Despite this, resistance did not cease. In remote regions, indigenous uprisings flared. Spiritual resistance took quieter forms, syncretic religions that merged Christian saints with native deities, hidden rituals conducted under the gaze of colonial churches. The flame of the old gods flickered on. Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, became a symbol of defiance. Though tortured and ultimately executed by the Spanish during an expedition to Honduras, his name endured in legend. In time, he would be remembered not as a defeated ruler, but as a hero, the final breath of a proud civilization. Centuries later, during Mexico's struggle for independence and its search for identity, the memory of the Aztecs returned with new power. Writers, poets, and revolutionaries looked to the past not with shame, but with pride. The eagle and cactus, the ancient prophecy of Tenochtitlan's founding, became the national emblem of Mexico. Nahuatl words peppered the language. Festivals, foods, and rituals carried echoes of the Mexica spirit. What began as the story of a humble migrant people fleeing from a mythical homeland, rejected by their neighbors, forced to build a city in a lake, had ended in glory, ruin, and rebirth. The Aztecs, through their tragedy, had become immortal. Today, their story continues not just in ruins and museums, but in the hearts of millions who still walk the land their ancestors shaped. Farmers planting maize by the moon, artisans weaving ancient symbols into modern cloth, children reciting tales of Quetzalcoatl and Huitzilopochtli. The empire is gone, but the culture endures. And so, the sun rises once more over the Valley of Mexico, where once stood a city of dreams, a people of fire and feathers, and a world built on the edge of heaven. Long before the clash of empires, long before the steel blades and muskets shattered their world, the Aztecs lived rich, complex lives that pulsed with rhythms of season, sun, and sacred time. Their history is often framed by war and sacrifice, but beneath those dramatic narratives was a civilization teeming with artistry, science, governance, and human emotion. To truly know the Aztecs, one must walk not just through the halls of their temples, but through the bustling markets, the calm homes, the classrooms, and the workshops that defined their daily existence. Tenochtitlan, the capital, was a marvel not just for its grandeur, but for its order. With a population estimated between 200,000 and 300,000, it was among the largest cities in the world at its height. divided into calpuli, districts that functioned like neighborhoods or clans. Each had its own temple, schools, and administrative offices. Canals ran between rows of homes. Stone streets were swept daily. Public baths and gardens dotted the city. Cleanliness was a cultural norm. People bathed regularly in the lake and used herbal soaps and incense to purify body and spirit. The architecture of daily life was functional, yet elegant. Homes were typically made of adobe with thatched or tiled roofs, consisting of a central room, a small altar, a kitchen space with a comel, flat griddle, and a backyard where turkeys or ducks might roam. There was a place for grinding maize with a metate, a flat stone used by women daily to prepare dough for tortillas and tamales. The scent of nixtamalized corn, wood smoke, and simmering beans was a constant backdrop to family life. Food was both sustenance and ritual. The Aztec diet was deeply sophisticated and plant-based, dominated by the Mesoamerican triad: maize, beans, and squash. They cultivated avocados, tomatoes, amaranth, chilies, cacao, and chayote. Protein came from insects, fish, ducks, and turkeys, and from chinampas that yielded frogs, axolotls, and edible algae. Chocolate, often consumed as a bitter drink with spices, was reserved for nobility and warriors. Markets were the heartbeats of cities. The most famous, Tlatelolco, operated daily and drew tens of thousands of buyers and sellers. It was an explosion of color and sound, vendors hawking everything from pottery to obsidian blades, textiles dyed in vivid hues, woven baskets, carved wooden masks, painted codices, medicinal herbs, and elaborate jewelry. Cocoa beans functioned as currency alongside copper axes and cotton cloth. Bartering was common, but value systems were precise. Work was gendered but balanced. Men typically farmed, fished, hunted, and went to war. Women were central to domestic life, education, food production, and textile arts. Weaving was a respected skill. Every girl was taught from a young age. The huipil, a traditional embroidered blouse, was not only clothing, but a canvas of identity, community, and artistry. Spindles and looms, often found in every household, were tools of culture as much as labor. Education was nearly universal, remarkably advanced for its time. Every child, regardless of gender or class, received instruction. Boys attended either the Telpochcali, where they were trained for military and civic duty, or the Kalmakak, reserved for the children of nobility, focusing on law, religion, astronomy, and governance. Girls were trained in religion, ethics, medicine, and domestic skills. Literacy in glyphs and pictographs was taught, as were ritual songs and philosophical thought. Philosophy was a living force. The Aztecs pondered existence in terms of balance and duality. They asked questions of purpose. Why are we here? What is the role of suffering? How does one live well and die with honor? Their answers lay in poetry and metaphor. The concept of In Xochitl in Cuauhtémoc, flower and song was the highest expression of truth, beauty, and the fleeting nature of life. Marriage was a cornerstone of society. It was often arranged, though not without consent. Ceremonies were elaborate, involving rituals that symbolized union and harmony, tying cloaks together, sharing maize, walking around fire. The couple would live with the groom's family, and both men and women could seek divorce in certain cases, showing a legal awareness of personal agency. The Aztecs had a detailed legal system. Laws governed theft, adultery, land disputes, and property rights. Judges were appointed by the state, and appeals could be made to higher courts. Punishments ranged from restitution to execution, but justice was rooted in communal order, not vengeance. Spiritual life was ever present. People carried amulets, made offerings at home altars, and observed countless feast days dedicated to gods and ancestors. Calendars marked sacred cycles. The interplay of the 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar year produced the 52-year bundle, a period culminating in a new fire ceremony. At its end, all fires were extinguished, and if the stars aligned, they were relit, symbolizing the continuation of the world. Art was not decoration, it was cosmology. Murals, pottery, sculptures, and codices told stories of gods, heroes, creation, and death. The stylized jaguar, eagle, serpent, and obsidian mirror were more than motifs. They were living symbols of power, mystery, and transformation. Featherwork, especially, was prized. Artisans created cloaks and headdresses of resplendent green quetzal feathers, worn by emperors and envoys. Music and dance were inseparable from ceremony. Drums, flutes, shell trumpets, and rattles echoed through temples and homes alike. Dancers adorned in paint and feathers moved in synchrony with celestial rhythms, invoking rain, honoring the dead, or preparing for war. Song was memory. Dance was devotion. Yet even in this vibrant world, not all was utopia. The Aztecs practiced slavery, not chattel slavery, but a form based on debt, punishment, or war. Slaves could own property, marry, and even buy their freedom. Still, it reveals the nuanced hierarchies of their world. Additionally, class distinctions were rigid. Nobility held political, religious, and military power, while commoners bore tribute burdens and limitations. Mobility was possible, but rare. What's striking, though, is the sense of purpose that infused life. The Aztecs believed deeply in their role within the cosmos. Every action, planting maize, raising children, offering incense, was part of a grand choreography. They were not merely subjects of an empire, they were actors in a sacred play whose end had already been foretold. This was the world that was lost, the world Cortés and his men could not see. They saw only temples and gold, blood and flame. But the true wealth of the Aztec world lay in its people, its ideas, its rhythms, and its poetry. And though the empire fell, the people did not disappear. Many traditions, foods, words, and customs survive today. They live in the bustling streets of modern Mexico, in the stories of elders, in the symbols of national pride. They endure in the maize harvested under the same sun, in the languages still spoken, in the resistance of memory. The Aztecs lived close to the gods, and through them, perhaps, we glimpse a truth of our own, that even empires may fall, but the soul of a people, if rooted deeply enough, will continue to rise. Within the towering temples and sprawling markets, the true heart of Aztec civilization beat inside the family unit. The Cali, or home, was not just a place of shelter. It was a center of identity, ritual, and instruction. Generations lived together in tight quarters, sharing space, food, labor, and wisdom. Children were not simply raised, they were shaped with intention. Parents taught discipline through stories, songs, and symbolic gestures. A crying child might have cold water sprinkled on their face, not to punish, but to instill fortitude. The family altar held special significance. In every home, even the humblest, offerings were placed to honor ancestors and household deities. Incense burned slowly in clay holders. Figurines of maize gods or fertility spirits sat near baskets of food. Life and death were not separate domains, but entwined in the rituals of everyday existence. Ancestors were remembered not only during major festivals, but at the dinner table, in lullabies, in the names passed down to newborns. Ceremonies marked every stage of life. Birth was attended by midwives who invoked the goddess Cuauhtémoc, the purifier of sin. The umbilical cord of a male child might be buried on a battlefield, symbolizing a future as a warrior. Girls' cords were buried near the hearth, anchoring them to the domestic and sacred. When a child reached maturity, a naming ceremony would invoke the cosmic calendar and the roles foreseen for them. Marriage, too, was richly ceremonial. The families negotiated terms, consulted diviners, and selected auspicious dates. A bride might be carried on the back of a relative to her new home, where fire was kindled in the hearth, uniting the couple under the god's gaze. Elders offered blessings, maize beer flowed, and dances swirled into the night. Death was not the end, but a transition. The Aztecs believed the afterlife depended on one's manner of death, not moral judgment. Warriors who died in battle, women who died in childbirth, and those sacrificed in ritual ascended to the sun. Others traveled to Mictlan, the underworld, a place not of punishment, but of endurance. Journeying through Mictlan took 4 years, guided by a spirit dog called Xoloitzcuintli. Funerals included cremation or burial, offerings of food, tools, and symbols of the deceased's profession. Loved ones mourned in poetry, singing of flowers that wither but never truly die. The dead were honored during Michaelhuitantli and Huey Michaelhuitl, precursors to what we now know as Dia de los Muertos. Craftsmanship was everywhere. The Aztecs were master builders, weavers, potters, and jewelers. Obsidian knives were sharper than steel. Gold was molded into delicate jewelry. Jade and turquoise adorned masks and religious items. Every object had purpose, utilitarian and sacred. Even cooking vessels bore images of gods and elements, linking nourishment with cosmic gratitude. Science, too, flourished. Aztec. Astronomers charted Venus, calculated solar movements, and aligned temples with celestial events. They predicted eclipses, solstices, and the arrival of rains. Their calendars were marvels of precision and complexity. Medicine combined spiritual knowledge with empirical treatments, herbal remedies, surgeries, and purification rituals. Temazcal, or sweat lodges, were used to cleanse the body and spirit. Trade routes stretched from the Gulf to the Pacific, through deserts and jungles. Merchant guilds, known as Porteca, were not mere traders. They were diplomats, spies, and explorers. They carried cacao, jade, obsidian, tropical birds, and regional knowledge. Their journeys helped unify the cultural world of Mesoamerica, and their stories brought distant lands into the minds of city dwellers. Justice, though strict, had nuance. Judges were trained in Kalmikak and expected to rule fairly. Trials could include testimony, oaths, and appeals. Stealing could be punished harshly, but intent and restitution mattered. Even nobles could be sentenced to death if they broke the law, a testament to the societal emphasis on duty and order. Women held more power than outsiders often realized. Though public office was rare, women were crucial economic, domestic, and spiritual figures. Priestesses led rites to fertility goddesses. Female healers tended the sick. Some women served as merchants, scribes, and even military figures under rare circumstances. Gender was structured, but it was not silencing. And woven through every aspect of life was a profound awareness of time. The Aztecs lived not for eternity, but for the present moment's sacred weight. They knew the world could end. They knew the sun required sacrifice, the gods needed song, and the soil demanded care. This gave life urgency, reverence, and beauty. In this way, the Aztecs were not so distant from us. They loved their children. They mourned their dead. They marveled at stars. They feared loss and longed for meaning. They built, they hoped, they dreamed. Their world, though ended in empire, endures in spirit. The next time you bite into maize, gaze at the moon, or hear the sound of a drum echo in the night, know that you are touching something ancient, something Aztec. Language was the vessel that carried Aztec civilization through the centuries, and its echo still resonates today. The Aztecs spoke Nahuatl, a poetic, richly descriptive language whose rhythms shaped thought, prayer, and law. Words were not just tools of communication. They were sacred bridges between the human and divine, between generations past and futures imagined. Nahuatl was filled with metaphor and duality. Abstract ideas were expressed through paired imagery, fire and water, jade and feathers, flower and song. A wise person was not simply knowledgeable, but tlaquiloa in Xochitl, in Cuauhtémoc, a person of flower and song, someone who lived with sensitivity and wisdom, who painted truth with both color and voice. Scribes, or tlaquilos, preserved knowledge in codices, books made of deerskin or bark paper, painted with vivid glyphs and scenes. These pictorial records documented everything from history and genealogy to astronomy and tribute. They were visual symphonies, combining art and documentation into one flowing narrative. Codices were kept by nobles, priests, and educators, and read aloud in public rituals to teach, to remember, and to bind a people together. Much of this knowledge was lost or destroyed after the conquest. Spanish missionaries, in their fervor to root out what they saw as paganism, burned hundreds of codices and temple archives. What survived did so by chance, or through the efforts of sympathetic friars and indigenous scribes who worked together to create hybrid documents, Nahuatl texts written in Roman letters, blending native tradition with colonial frameworks. And yet, Nahuatl endures. Today, it remains spoken by over 1.5 million people across central Mexico. Many of its words have entered modern Spanish and even English: chocolate, avocado, tomato, coyote, chili, guacamole. These are not just culinary artifacts. They are the sounds of an ancient tongue whispering into our modern lives. Beyond language, memory was ritualized. The Aztecs remembered through dance, through the naming of days, through the telling of origin stories. Children learned history not as a distant chronicle, but as part of their bloodline. Myths were lived, not studied. Every festival was a reenactment, every temple stone a testament. This devotion to remembrance meant that even in the shadow of conquest, cultural continuity remained. While political power was shattered, the spirit of the Mexica found ways to survive. Through oral traditions passed from mother to child, through farmers who still planted by moon cycles, through prayers spoken in secret, the heart of the Aztec world never stopped beating. Under colonial rule, many indigenous practices were outlawed, yet many simply went underground. Festivals to Huitzilopochtli became feasts for saints. Offerings to the rain god Tlaloc became blessings for San Juan. Feathered cloaks were hidden or repurposed. The new fire ceremony was discontinued, but its memory remained in stories. This quiet resistance ensured that culture was not erased, only transformed. The Spanish brought the printing press, but the Nahuas brought a memory that needed no ink. They remembered in dance steps and drum beats. They remembered in maize kernels, carefully saved each season. They remembered in embroidery and lullabies, and the tilt of a child's name towards stars long worshipped. Some memory was collective. Much was personal. For those who had seen the empire's fall, the elders who had once walked Tenochtitlan's canals, who had heard Moctezuma speak from his palace, who had seen the eagle on the cactus. The world they knew had ended, but they kept it alive with stories. And through those stories, that world found roots again. In the centuries that followed, the idea of being Aztec became both a pride and a burden. In colonial Mexico, indigenous identity was suppressed, taxed, and regulated, but it also became a source of resistance, especially during independence movements. Writers, scholars, and artists rediscovered Nahua heritage. The Codex Mendoza, the Florentine Codex, and other hybrid texts became tools of rediscovery. In modern Mexico, the Aztec legacy is everywhere, from the names of cities and mountains to national symbols. The eagle devouring a snake atop a cactus, drawn from Mexican mythology, flies proudly at the center of the national flag. Statues of Cuauhtémoc grace plazas and boulevards. School children learn of Tenochtitlan's wonders and its fall, not as foreign history, but as the foundation of their land. And yet, perhaps the truest legacy of the Aztecs lies in their enduring worldview, one that saw life as fleeting and beautiful, suffering as sacred, duty as destiny. A worldview that revered balance, respected time, and honored both life and death as two halves of the same divine song. The empire is gone, but if you close your eyes, you can still hear the chants echoing through time. The drums still beat. The gods still whisper. And the language of flower and song still blooms in hearts that remember. To understand the Aztecs is to enter a sacred web of gods, myths, and symbols that shaped not just their religion, but every dimension of life. Government, war, agriculture, love, and death. The Aztec pantheon was vast, intricate, and alive with symbolism. The gods were not remote figures in the sky. They were ever-present forces, embodied in rain, fire, wind, the soil beneath one's feet, and the stars that marched overhead. At the heart of this divine tapestry stood Huitzilopochtli, the patron god of the Mexica people and one of the most important deities in Aztec religion, representing both the sun and war. Huitzilopochtli's mythic birth was as violent as it was symbolic. Born of the earth goddess Coatlicue, he emerged fully formed and armed, immediately slaying his siblings who had plotted to kill their mother. This tale not only affirmed the Aztecs' militaristic identity, but also aligned them cosmically. Their empire was the will of the sun, and their wars were sacred. The Templo Mayor, the grand double pyramid at the center of Tenochtitlan, was the axis of this theology. One shrine atop the pyramid was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the other to Tlaloc, the rain god. This duality, war and agriculture, fire and water, sacrifice and sustenance, was the core principle of Aztec cosmology. Everything in life existed in pairs, in balance, and only through ritual could this balance be maintained. Tlaloc, the rainbringer, was revered and feared. His domain was not gentle rains and flowers, but thunder, floods, and lightning. His temple was adorned with serpent imagery and water motifs. Children were sometimes sacrificed to Tlaloc, especially during droughts, their tears seen as metaphysical prayers to the rain god. Though harrowing to modern sensibilities, such rites underscored the deep desperation and dependency on the forces of nature that the Aztecs acknowledged with ritual honesty. Beside these central gods stood a pantheon of powerful beings. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was the god of wind, learning, and priesthood. He was a culture hero, said to have brought maize to humanity, invented books and calendars, and ruled with wisdom and peace. His legend includes a departure, sailing eastward, vowing to return, which some believe may have contributed to Moctezuma's cautious welcome of the Spanish. Quetzalcoatl embodied renewal, reason, and sacrifice, not of others, but of the self. Opposing him in many ways was Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a god of night, sorcery, destiny, and chaos. He was unpredictable and ever watching, his obsidian mirror reflecting the hidden truths of the soul. Where Quetzalcoatl inspired, Tezcatlipoca tested. Their rivalry and myth mirrored cosmic tension between order and fate, clarity and illusion. Then there was Xipe Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, the god of rebirth and agriculture. Priests would wear flayed human skins during his festivals to symbolize the shedding of old growth and the arrival of spring. It was a gruesome image to outsiders, but to the Aztecs, it expressed the brutal truth of the earth, that life comes from death, that crops grow from decay. Xochipilli, the god of flowers, love, and poetry, offered a lighter spiritual path. Patron of artists and dancers, his name meant flower prince. He was honored in music and celebration, in festivals filled with color and joy. Where Huitzilopochtli demanded hearts, Xochipilli inspired them. His presence reminded the people that beauty was not just indulgence, it was divine. Every god had temples, feast days, rituals, and prayers. Their worship was not isolated to priests. Every citizen participated in the sacred calendar, offering incense, food, or blood. Pilgrimages were common, especially to distant sacred sites like Teotihuacan, whose pyramids the Aztecs believed were built by the gods themselves. Myth was not abstract, it was alive. Children learned the story of the 5 suns, the 5 ages of the world. Each previous world had ended in catastrophe, one by jaguars, another by wind, another by fire, another by flood. The current world, the 5th sun, required blood to survive. If the gods were not fed, the sun would not rise, the sky would collapse, and time would end. The calendar reflected these beliefs. The Tonalpohualli, a 260-day cycle of 20 day signs and 13 numbers, guided ritual timing and personal destiny. Each person was born under a specific day sign, governed by a deity which shaped their character and fate. Combined with the Xupuhuali, the 365-day solar calendar, these systems intertwined daily life with cosmic rhythm. Temples were sacred not just for worship, but as cosmic replicas. They were modeled after mountains, where gods were believed to reside, and oriented to celestial events. The alignment of temples with solstices and equinoxes reflected the Aztecs' astronomical knowledge. They understood the Venus cycle, tracked eclipses, and wove the heavens into every rite. Ceremony was a total experience. Rituals included elaborate dress, music, incense, speech, and offerings. Priests fasted and prepared for days, often bleeding themselves in acts of devotion. Festivals like Tlacaxipehualisli, Huitozozli, and Teotleco punctuated the year, each with its own processions, dances, and sacrifices. Every season was marked by interaction with the divine. Even rulers were spiritual figures. The Tlatoani emperor was not just a political leader, he was a priest, a philosopher, a speaker of sacred truth. He led major rituals, consulted diviners, and was expected to live with humility and cosmic awareness. His words were believed to be infused with sacred authority. The Aztecs did not separate religion from life. The sacred infused everything: agriculture, politics, art, birth, death. To plant maize was to reenact the gods' sacrifice. To grind corn, to weave cloth, to tell stories. All were sacred acts, done with reverence. To live, then, was to walk constantly in the shadow and light of the divine. The Aztecs feared their gods, but also loved and honored them. They believed that the cosmos was fragile, life was fleeting, and beauty was truth. Their world was harsh, yes, but also filled with wonder, music, and meaning. And even now, long after the fall of their temples and the silence of their drums, that sacred rhythm endures. It lives in memory, language, tradition, and spirit. In every mountain mist, every poppy blooming on an ancient trail, every Nahuatl word whispered to a child, the gods still walk, quiet, watchful, eternal. In the Aztec world, the spiritual was not an abstraction. It was a governing force, a daily presence that shaped every breath of existence. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the structure and influence of the priesthood, the religious elite who served as the eyes, ears, and hands of the gods within human society. The Tlamatcazque, or priests, were far more than ceremonial figures. They were scientists, astronomers, healers, philosophers, judges, and oracles. Chosen in youth and trained from childhood, they led lives of discipline and hardship. They were celibate, often fasting, rising before dawn to chant prayers, and piercing their ears, tongues, and genitals with obsidian blades in acts of penitential bloodletting. This pain was not for spectacle. It was considered nourishment for the gods, a personal sacrifice that mirrored the divine suffering that created the world. Priests were responsible for the sacred calendar, the intertwining systems of time that governed the rhythm of rituals. Each day was sacred, each number and symbol filled with meaning. They calculated festivals, advised rulers on omens, interpreted dreams, and ensured that no rite occurred on an inauspicious date. Their knowledge of astronomy rivaled that of any in the old world. From atop their temples, they tracked the movements of Venus, eclipses, and equinoxes, cosmic events believed to reflect divine will. The most powerful religious figure was the high priest of Huitzilopochtli, who conducted state ceremonies, led sacrifices, and advised the emperor on matters both political and metaphysical. Alongside him were priests of other cults, Tlaloc, Tezcatlipoca, Quetzalcoatl, each with their own hierarchy, traditions, and training schools. The initiation of a young priest was a profound transformation. After years of discipline and study, the initiate might undertake a vision quest, fasting in isolation, seeking communion with the divine. Upon completion, he would don ritual garb, often made of jaguar skin, and receive the sacred implements, the obsidian knife, the incense pouch, the prayer scroll. His voice became not his own, but the echo of God's. Temples, especially the great ones like the Templo Mayor, were living books of theology. Their carvings told the stories of cosmic creation, divine battles, and sacred laws. They housed idols, often gigantic, adorned with feathers, jade, and gold, into which the gods were believed to descend during rituals. Offerings of food, flowers, incense, and blood were made daily. Nothing was left to chance. Every action was ritualized, every movement symbolic. One of the most dramatic religious roles was that of the Ixiptla, the human impersonator of a god. During major festivals, a chosen individual, often a captive warrior, was dressed and treated as a deity for an entire year. He would be fed, clothed in finery, taught sacred songs, and honored by nobles and priests alike. His every step reenacted the god's presence on earth. At the end of the cycle, in a climactic ritual, he would ascend the temple steps and be sacrificed, not as a victim, but as a divine being returning to the celestial realm. Rituals ranged from quiet offerings to large-scale spectacles. In some ceremonies, hundreds of captives were sacrificed over the course of several days. Processions of dancers, drummers, and painted warriors paraded through the streets, accompanied by flutes, chants, and incense. Blood, far from being a grotesque substance, was viewed as a sacred elixir, the fuel of life, the essence of the soul. But Aztec religion was not merely about death. It was equally about renewal, fertility, and cosmic alignment. Festivals like Huitzilopochtli celebrated the sowing of maize. Others mark the rainy season, the new year, or the movement of celestial bodies. Each celebration affirmed that humans were co-creators of the cosmos, participants in a grand and fragile balance. Divination played a major role in personal and political life. Priests used tonalamatl, sacred almanacs, to interpret fate. They read omens in the flight of birds, the pattern of spilled maize, or the cracks in a turtle shell. These signs determined everything from marriage dates to battle strategies. To ignore them was to invite catastrophe. Governance itself was deeply theocratic. The Tlatoani ruled by divine mandate, believed to be chosen by the gods. His legitimacy came not just from noble blood or military victory, but from ritual. Coronation ceremonies involved days of fasting, purification, and offerings. He would ascend the temple steps, offer his own blood, and vow to uphold the sacred order. Failure in leadership could be seen as divine disfavor. Earthquakes, droughts, or eclipses were not just natural events, they were warnings. The gods were always watching, always demanding balance. A careless ruler could be deposed, even sacrificed, if he failed to uphold cosmic harmony. But the Aztecs also believed in redemption. Ritual cleansing, confession, and penance were possible. The goddess Tlazolteotl, the eater of filth, could forgive sins if one confessed honestly. Spiritual healing was practiced through chants, herbs, and the intervention of specific deities. The idea of moral correction, of returning to balance, ran deep through their theology. This deeply spiritual culture did not separate sacred from mundane. To plant maize, to teach a child, to craft a bowl, these were acts of devotion. The world was a temple, and every soul a participant in a divine narrative. And though the Spanish conquerors desecrated the temples, melted the idols, and outlawed the rituals, the spirit of this sacred worldview never truly died. It persisted in hidden rites, in whispered Nahuatl prayers, in the unbroken gaze of mountains once seen as gods. Even now, centuries later, as modern Mexico bustles with concrete and commerce, the sacred still lives. In festivals, in language, in song. The gods may no longer require blood, but they have not been forgotten. They remain in the wind, in the rain, in the fire, silent but ever present. Beyond the rituals, beyond the temples and sacrifices, there existed in Aztec civilization a profound philosophical soul, a worldview forged not just in fire and blood, but in metaphor, introspection, and poetry. The Aztecs were not only warriors and priests, they were thinkers. Their priests were philosophers, their rulers, poets, and their language was shaped by a constant yearning to understand the mystery of being alive in a fragile, divine universe. At the core of Aztec thought was the recognition of impermanence. They knew that life was fleeting, like the dew on a flower or the breath of wind at dawn. This was not a cause for despair, but for reverence. In Nahuatl poetry, this theme is echoed again and again. Are we truly alive on earth? Not forever, only for a brief time. These were not rhetorical flourishes, they were expressions. of a spiritual realism. To live was to walk upon the face of the earth briefly, knowing it could vanish in an instant. It made beauty more urgent. It made song more necessary. The Aztecs saw the world as in Tlaltecpac, on the earth's surface, a temporary space between the heavens above and the underworld below. Human beings were placed in the middle, charged with maintaining the equilibrium between these realms. They were not the center of the universe, but its caretakers. Their rituals, songs, and offerings were not attempts to control the gods, but to thank them, to acknowledge that everything they had was borrowed. This sacred humility infused their ethics. The goal of life was not dominance, but balance. To be a good person was to be well-rooted, like a tree with strong roots and supple branches. Wisdom was the ability to stand firm, to act with restraint, and to speak with clarity. Elders advised youth not to be like soft clay that takes any shape, nor like brittle wood that breaks. One must be steady, yet adaptable, always aware that one walks on slippery ground. The Aztecs developed a genre of speech called Huehuetlatoli, the speech of the old ones. These were traditional sayings, proverbs, and teachings passed down through generations. They were spoken at ceremonies, at schools, in family gatherings, reminders of values, duties, and the transience of joy and sorrow. Many began with phrases like, "My child, you have come into the world," and guided listeners through the responsibilities of living with wisdom, courage, and grace. A recurring metaphor in their thought was the flower and the song, in Xochitl, in Cuauhtémoc. This phrase embodied the highest expression of truth and meaning. Flowers represented beauty, fragility, and the earth. Song represented voice, spirit, and the divine. Together, they were a way of understanding the fleeting nature of life and the enduring power of expression. The most respected individuals were those who could paint truth with words and carry memory through melody. Even death was viewed not as an end, but a transformation. The Aztecs did not fear death in the same way many modern societies do. They believed the soul continued on a journey, shaped not by moral judgment, but by cosmic law. Warriors slain in battle returned to follow the sun across the sky. Women who died in childbirth joined the gods of the West. Others, depending on their lives, passed into Mictlan, the underworld, a realm neither cruel nor kind, but one of challenges and endurance. And so, they lived with the certainty of death, but also with the celebration of each breath. Every ritual reaffirmed life's fragility. Every offering of incense was a recognition of grace. Every drumbeat echoed the heartbeat of the earth. Even the great pyramids, those stone giants, were not monuments to human triumph, but reminders of humanity's place in the cosmos. This philosophical spirituality permeated governance and justice. Rulers were expected to act with Teotl, the sacred force that ran through all things. They were judged not just on law or success in war, but on their speech, their humility, their ability to listen to the gods and guide the people. Leaders who became arrogant or cruel were seen as having broken the cosmic order and could be removed or even sacrificed. The Aztecs believed that language itself was divine. To speak well was to honor the gods. To misuse words was a spiritual offense. Oratory, poetry, and careful conversation were forms of worship. Silence, too, had power, especially before speaking truths or making judgments. A wise person knew when to speak and when to remain still. And though their civilization fell beneath foreign swords, this way of seeing the world survived. It lives in Nahuatl songs, still sung, in poems recited on the Day of the Dead, in the quiet pride of descendants who carry ancient wisdom in their blood. It lives in farmers who bless the soil before planting, in artisans who carve the old gods into new forms, in children learning the words their great-great-grandparents spoke. The Aztecs knew that life was fragile, but they also knew it was sacred. They asked not to live forever, but to live truly, to sing their song, to bloom like a flower, and to return, finally, to the embrace of the gods. To the Aztecs, war was never simply a matter of land or power. It was an extension of the sacred, a cosmic necessity, and a societal engine. From the highest temple to the humblest Calpulli, the empire revolved around conflict, not as chaos, but as order. A divine choreography, where warriors fought not only for victory, but for the survival of the universe itself. The Aztec name for war, Xochiaoyotl, literally meant flower war. It was an expression of paradox, beauty in bloodshed, life in death. For the Aztecs, war was sacred theatre, a means to fulfill religious obligation, to demonstrate valor, and to provide the most potent offering to the gods, human hearts. Warfare began with training, and every male Aztec, regardless of class, was expected to become a warrior. Boys began their martial education as early as age 7. They were taught discipline, strength, endurance, and strategy. In the Telpochcali, the school for commoners, young men learned to march, to throw spears, and to carry heavy burdens. They were hardened with cold baths, fasting, and long treks through forests and mountains. For noble sons, education took place in the Kalmakak, where spiritual and military instruction blended. These elite students learned not just to fight, but to lead, to speak in the court, to interpret omens, to wield the macuahuitl with precision, and to embody the sacred duty of the warrior. The macuahuitl was the Aztecs' primary weapon, a wooden sword embedded with sharp obsidian blades. Though it lacked the penetration of steel, it could slice through flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. Alongside it were atlatls, spear throwers, slings, clubs, and bows. Warriors adorned themselves in vibrant regalia, jaguar skins, eagle feathers, and painted shields, each costume signifying a rank or divine association. Two of the most prestigious military orders were the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors. The former were aligned with the sun, bravery, and sky, the latter with the night, stealth, and earth. These were not simply fighters, they were embodiments of cosmic forces. Their roles extended beyond the battlefield to ritual and political life. They participated in sacrifices, ceremonies, and state events, honored as elite protectors of the realm. But not all warfare was for expansion. The Aztecs also engaged in ritual warfare, the so-called flowery wars. These conflicts, prearranged with rival city-states like Tlaxcala and Huexotzinco, were not fought to conquer land, but to obtain captives for religious sacrifice. This practice served multiple purposes: to demonstrate strength, to train warriors, and to sustain the gods' need for life force. In these battles, soldiers sought not to kill, but to capture. Warriors were ranked not by kills, but by the number and quality of prisoners taken. A young man who captured his first foe became eligible for higher honors. Multiple captives elevated one's status, allowing for marriage, land ownership, or even a place in the nobility. Captives were paraded, honored, and ultimately sacrificed during festivals, a transformation from enemy to divine offering. Military campaigns were organized with meticulous care. Before a campaign, priests would consult omens and the sacred calendar. If the signs were favorable, messengers would be sent to enemy cities, offering them one last chance to submit. If they refused, war was declared through symbolic acts, tearing down idols, throwing spears into sacred ground. Aztec armies were hierarchical and disciplined. Ranks included Cuauhtémoc, shaved-head warriors, Otontin, elite shock troops, and vast levies from allied and tributary cities. War drums signaled maneuvers, standards marked units. Generals planned ambushes, flanking moves, and night raids. Though the Aztecs lacked cavalry and siege weapons, they excelled in terrain familiarity, morale, and religious motivation. Victories were celebrated with grandeur. Warriors were honored with feasts, gifts, and elevation in status. Songs were composed, murals painted, and names remembered. The spoils of war, tribute, slaves, precious goods, fueled the empire's expansion and grandeur. Yet, there was also a deep spiritual solemnity to war. The stakes were cosmic. Without captives, the sun might not rise. Without sacrifice, the world might end. Every battle was, in essence, a defense of the universe itself. Failure in battle could lead to disgrace, or worse. Captured Aztec soldiers were often sacrificed in enemy rituals. However, such a death was not considered shameful. To die in combat or upon the stone slab of an enemy temple was still an honorable path to the afterlife, a return to the gods. Women played important, though indirect, roles in the culture of war. Mothers raised warriors and composed songs of mourning and pride. Women who died in childbirth were considered spiritual equals to warriors who fell in battle. They had given life through pain and sacrifice, and thus earned eternal honor. The Aztec concept of tequila emphasized duty over desire. Warriors did not fight for personal gain. They fought for family, city, and cosmos. A soldier's life was structured, demanding, and saturated with symbolism. They understood that while death was inevitable, glory was not. It had to be earned through courage, skill, and unwavering devotion to the gods. As the empire expanded, so too did its dependence on military conquest. The tribute system, the calendar of festivals, and the grandeur of Tenochtitlan all relied on a steady influx of captives and goods. Yet this also sowed the seeds of dissent. As more cities came under Aztec control, resentment grew. Harsh tribute demands and sacrificial fears turned former allies into enemies, vulnerabilities that the Spanish would later exploit. Still, in its time, the Aztec military machine was among the most efficient and ideologically complete in the world. It fused statecraft with myth, discipline with devotion, violence with transcendence. It was not merely about power, it was about meaning. To fight for the Aztecs was to take one's place in a cosmic rhythm, to offer blood for the sun, to walk the path of gods, and to ensure that time would continue. Victory on the battlefield was not the end of the Aztec warrior's journey. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a new cycle of ritual, memory, and transformation. For the Aztecs, war was not a single act. It was a sacred continuum, reaching beyond the clash of weapons into the realms of identity, cosmology, and public life. Upon returning from campaign, Aztec warriors were received with both reverence and solemnity. Captives were paraded through city streets, their fates already written in the blood-scripted stars. The city would awaken with drums and dances. Priests anointed warriors with ceremonial pigments. Incense thickened the air. Banners snapped in the wind. This public display was not merely a celebration, it was a ritual of reintegration, ensuring that sacred energy from war was returned to the community in structured, meaningful ways. Warriors were expected to confess their deeds, not only the names of those captured or killed, but their emotions, failures, and fears. In front of elders and priests, they described their actions with honesty. This was not for glory alone, but for purification. No blood could be spilled without spiritual accounting. Even warriors who returned victorious had to undergo ritual cleansings, fasting, bathing, and sometimes bloodletting to remove the spiritual residue of violence. For those who had captured foes, new honors awaited. The warrior's body became a living record of his victories. Certain numbers of captives earned the right to wear specific headdresses, cloaks, and jewelry. Warrior insignia were not ornamental, they were sacred markers of devotion, engraved in fabric and skin. Warriors could be tattooed with day signs, god symbols, or stylized eagles and jaguars, transforming their flesh into a codex of conquest. Some of the highest honors included rights to land, nobility titles, and positions of leadership. A commoner who proved himself in battle could rise socially, demonstrating the rare paths of meritocratic mobility within Aztec society. This gave every soldier, regardless of birth, a reason to fight, not just for the gods, but for personal elevation. But for the captives, the path led to sacrifice. Depending on the festival and god, They might be kept for days or weeks, given food, allowed to speak, even dressed in ceremonial regalia. Sacrifice was not viewed as humiliation. It was the culmination of divine purpose. Some captives fought in mock battles, reenacting the struggles of gods. Others walked to the top of pyramids in silence, as thousands watched. The moment of sacrifice was choreographed with precision. The heart, considered the seat of tonali, the animating soul warmth, was offered to the sky. Blood, far from being discarded, was smeared on statues, poured on altars, and used in painting sacred glyphs. This was not butchery, but communion, a return of divine energy to the cosmos. Afterwards, the city entered a period of reflection and feasting. The bodies of sacrificed captives might be buried, displayed, or ritually consumed in symbolic cannibalism by elite priestly classes. These acts, horrifying to the Spanish and often misunderstood by outsiders, were meant to imitate the mythic cycles of death and rebirth. Just as maize required burial before it could grow, so too did divine life require sacrifice to flourish. And what of those who failed? Warriors who returned without captives or who fled battle faced shame and ritual atonement. They might be denied certain garments, banned from festivals, or forced to serve menial temple duties until they redeemed themselves. Cowardice was not merely dishonorable, it was a disruption of the cosmic balance, a spiritual rupture requiring repair. Despite these pressures, the camaraderie of warriors was profound. Brotherhoods of soldiers, bonded through shared ritual and battle, formed networks of loyalty and tradition. Songs were composed, honoring fallen comrades. Memorial dances were held. Heroes were remembered not only in sculpture or inscription, but in the voices of those who had fought beside them. The trauma of warfare, though rarely acknowledged directly in Aztec texts, must have been real. The Aztecs were human. They felt fear, grief, and loss. And they processed these emotions through ritualized catharsis, through offerings, poetry, and public mourning. Mothers wept for sons, wives sang laments. The cycle of life, war, and death was both brutal and deeply compassionate in its own sacred logic. In time, the very efficiency and religiosity of the Aztec war machine became its own undoing. The demand for captives grew too great. Tributary cities chafed under the weight of expectation. Neighboring city-states saw more risk than reward. And when the Spanish arrived, many of these discontented peoples joined them, not out of love for Europe, but hatred for Tenochtitlan's unrelenting grip. Still, the legacy of Aztec warfare is undeniable. It produced some of the most striking visual art, complex social systems, and deeply symbolic rituals in world history. War was their theology in motion. It structured their time, their architecture, their festivals, and their worldview. And when the sun set over their final battlefield, it did so not just on soldiers, but on a civilization that had tried to turn conflict into cosmic purpose, sacrifice into sustenance, and blood into the ink of the divine. In the year 1519, under a sky thick with omens and dread, the horizon of the Aztec world darkened with sails. The arrival of Hernán Cortés and his band of Spanish conquistadors marked not just an invasion of soldiers, but the beginning of a cataclysm that would shake the foundations of the Mexica cosmos. At the heart of this unfolding tragedy stood Moctezuma II, the ninth Tlatoani of the Mexica. A ruler of immense power, intellect, and spiritual sensitivity, he presided over an empire at its zenith. Tribute poured in from every direction. Tenochtitlan gleamed on its lake like a jewel in the sun. Yet within Moctezuma, there stirred a deep sense of unease. For years, the priests had whispered of strange omens, flames dancing in the sky, a temple struck by lightning, mysterious voices on the wind. The calendar cycle neared its end. The gods were restless. Then came the reports, strange men with white skin and shining armor, landing on the coast. They rode beasts never seen before, horses, and wielded thunder that could tear through stone. They bore crosses and banners, spoke of a distant king, and demanded submission. To the Aztecs, these were not merely foreigners, they were possible fulfillments of prophecy. Moctezuma's dilemma was more complex than simple fear. His kingdom was built not only on military might, but on a spiritual understanding of time and fate. The legend of Quetzalcoatl, the exiled god who would return from the east, lingered in the sacred memory. Cortés had arrived from that direction. His appearance, his timing, even his bearing, all seemed to match the ancient stories. So the emperor hesitated. Rather than meet the invaders with immediate force, Moctezuma sent emissaries bearing gifts, golden discs, feathered cloaks, cacao, and obsidian. These were not bribes, but ritual offerings, meant to assess the visitors, to honor the possibility of divinity, and to delay confrontation. But to Cortés, they were confirmation of Aztec wealth and weakness. He pressed forward, aided by local translators, including the critical figure of La Malinche, a Nahua woman who spoke both Maya and later Spanish, and who would become Cortés's interpreter, advisor, and the symbolic mother of Mestizo Mexico. As the Spaniards marched inland, they encountered resistance, but also opportunity. The Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Mexica, allied with Cortés. They provided warriors, intelligence, and legitimacy. Together, this alliance marched on Cholula, one of the most sacred cities in Mesoamerica. There, Cortés carried out a massacre. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of nobles and priests slain under the guise of diplomacy. The message was clear. This was no divine return. This was conquest. Still, Moctezuma did not attack. Instead, he sent a delegation inviting the Spaniards to Tenochtitlan itself. It was a moment of breathtaking complexity. The capital of the Aztecs, at the height of its beauty, opened its causeways to the very men who would destroy it. The Spaniards entered the city in awe, witnessing the canals, the markets, the pyramids, and the precision of its layout. They saw a metropolis unlike any in Europe. Yet behind their admiration lay ambition. Moctezuma received them with deference, He offered gifts, housing, and audience. Some accounts suggest he tried to make Cortés a vassal of the empire. Others claim he openly surrendered sovereignty, believing Cortés to be divine. Most likely, he played a delicate political game, one foot in diplomacy, the other in uncertainty, trying to avoid bloodshed until he could fully understand the threat. But it was too late. Within weeks, the Spanish seized Moctezuma in his own palace, effectively making him a prisoner. Though he remained a figurehead, his power evaporated. The emperor of the greatest empire in the Americas had become a puppet, held hostage by men who spoke a foreign tongue and knew nothing of the gods he served. Tensions mounted. Mexican nobles bristled at the indignity. The people grew restless. Then came the moment that shattered the illusion of peace. During the festival of Tenochtitlan, while the Aztecs were dancing and offering to the god Tezcatlipoca, the Spaniards attacked, massacring priests, nobles, and dancers in the great temple courtyard. Blood soaked the sacred stones. The city erupted. The people rose in fury. The causeways were barricaded. The Spaniards, surrounded in a hostile city, had lost control. Desperate, they pushed Moctezuma to speak to his people and calm them. But when he appeared on the palace rooftop and called for peace, the crowd hurled stones. Some say he was struck down by his own people. Others believe the Spanish killed him when he was no longer useful. What is certain is this: Moctezuma was dead, and the Mexica would not submit. Cortés and his men fled the city in what would become known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. As they crept across the moonlit causeways, laden with gold and wounded pride, the Aztecs attacked. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of allies were killed, their bodies tumbling into the lake. Cortés barely escaped with his life, but the story was not yet over. This was not the end of the Aztecs, but the beginning of their final resistance. They would regroup, they would fight, and their capital would soon become a battlefield, unlike any the New World had seen. After the disaster of La Noche Triste, Cortés retreated with his battered forces and Tlaxcalan allies. The road back to the coast was long, but he was far from defeated. He regrouped, negotiated for reinforcements, and began preparations for a final, devastating return to the Valley of Mexico. Meanwhile, inside Tenochtitlan, the people mourned and regrouped. The emperor was dead, but a new leader rose, Cuauhtémoc, a young nobleman and seasoned warrior. His name meant descending sun, or one who descends like an eagle. He would be the last Tlatoani of the Aztec Empire, and under his rule, the city would not go down without a fight. Cuauhtémoc knew what was coming. The Spanish would return, and they would bring war unlike any the empire had ever known. So he prepared. He rallied warriors, fortified causeways, stockpiled food, and bolstered defenses. The chinampas, floating gardens, were reinforced as supply zones. Temples once reserved for ritual now became watchtowers and arsenals. The people of Tenochtitlan, wounded but proud, steeled themselves for what would be a battle of survival. In 1521, Cortés returned, his force now immense, reinforced with soldiers, artillery, and a full fleet of brigantines, warships built in secret on the shores of Lake Texcoco. He moved to encircle the city. These ships would prove critical. They allowed Cortés to dominate the water, sever supply routes, and bombard the city from the lake. The Aztecs had no navy. Their canoes and swimmers could not match the Spanish cannon. The siege began. Day after day, week after week, the noose tightened. Cortés cut off aqueducts, poisoned wells, destroyed causeways, and burned districts. But the Mexica resisted with a fury that stunned their enemies. Every advance was met with counterattack. Warriors launched raids at night, sabotaged boats, and fought with obsidian blades and burning arrows. The temple steps were slick with blood, but never bowed in surrender. As the siege dragged on, hunger set in, disease spread. The once bustling markets of Tlatelolco became desolate. Children died of thirst. Corn was rationed, then gone. Dogs, roots, leather, nothing was spared. But Cuauhtémoc remained resolute. He refused Spanish offers of peace. He fought for every canal, every bridge, every stone. The Spanish were relentless. Their cannons shattered walls. Their swords cut through exhausted defenders. And their allies, Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, and others, fought with. Vengeance, eager to see Tenochtitlan fall. The city burned, crumbled, and drowned. The shimmering capital of a once mighty empire became a graveyard of smoke and ruin. And still, the Mexica did not yield. Cuauhtémoc led from the front, wounded but unbroken. His leadership inspired even in the face of collapse. But there was no relief. On August 13th, 1521, after 93 days of siege, starvation, and slaughter, Cuauhtémoc attempted a final escape across the lake in a canoe. He was captured by Spanish ships, dragged before Cortés, and demanded to be killed with honor. "This is the end," he said. "Now take your dagger and finish me." Cortés refused, for the moment. He spared the young emperor to parade him as a prize. But the empire was finished. Tenochtitlan, once called the Venice of the New World, was no more. Its temples were razed, its people enslaved or scattered. The lakes were drained. On its ruins, the Spanish began building a new city, Mexico City, the colonial capital of New Spain. But even in its fall, the Aztec spirit refused silence. Cuauhtémoc, though later tortured and executed under suspicion of rebellion, became a symbol of defiance. His name would echo in later revolutions. The memory of Tenochtitlan would live on in song, in stone, in the bloodlines of survivors. The fall of the city was not merely a military defeat. It was the destruction of a cosmology, a way of seeing the universe. The sacred calendar stopped. The rituals were outlawed. The gods' statues were smashed. Priests were killed or converted. Nahuatl was banned in schools. And yet, in homes, in whispers, in memory, the old world survived. The sun had set on the Aztec Empire, but its light would burn on, in poetry, in tradition, and in the hearts of its descendants. The year 1521 did not bring an end, but a transformation. Though Tenochtitlan lay in ruin, though the Tlatoani had fallen, and though the temples no longer smoked with incense, the Aztecs did not vanish. The Mexica people, those who had once ruled an empire, continued to breathe, to remember, and to resist in ways subtle, spiritual, and enduring. The Spanish conquest ushered in a brutal new order. The colonizers dismantled the political structure, erased the nobility, and imposed Catholicism with fire and steel. The encomienda system turned surviving indigenous communities into labor reserves, forcing them to till fields and build the very churches that replaced their temples. Epidemics, smallpox, measles, typhus, swept through villages, reducing populations by the millions. The cultural genocide was swift, calculated, and devastating. Yet even in subjugation, the Nahua peoples did not become empty vessels. They adapted, often in brilliant ways. Within a generation, hybrid forms of identity began to emerge. Catholic, but also deeply Nahua, Spanish-speaking but still fluent in Nahuatl, baptized but carrying in memory the old gods and stories. Colonial missionaries, particularly the Franciscans, saw value in Nahua knowledge. With the help of indigenous scribes, they compiled massive ethnographic works, including the Florentine Codex, a monumental text recording Aztec life, beliefs, and history in both Spanish and Nahuatl. These efforts, though shaped by colonial bias, preserved voices that would have otherwise been silenced. Education became another site of survival. Schools for indigenous elites, such as the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco, taught Latin, theology, and European science, but also allowed Nahua youths to write their own histories, compose poetry, and maintain intellectual continuity. A new class of mestizo and indigenous scholars emerged, straddling two worlds, translating the past into a survivable present. Ritual life also continued, disguised, transformed, but alive. Catholic saints began to bear the traits of former gods. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who appeared to an indigenous man on a former site of Tonantzin worship, became a syncretic symbol of hope. Festivals retained their timing, music, and color, even as their names changed. The Day of the Dead, originally tied to Aztec harvest and ancestor rituals, became a fusion of old and new. Architecture reflected this duality. Churches were often built directly atop pyramid ruins, as if to overwrite memory. Yet buried beneath these structures, archaeologists have uncovered remnants of the Templo Maya, sacred carvings, and offerings. The stones of the old world quite literally support the foundations of the new. Some resistance was overt. Uprisings erupted periodically. Rural revolts, tax refusals, calls to return to ancestral ways. Others resisted in quieter ways, by speaking Nahuatl at home, by painting gods in the margins of manuscripts, by naming children after ancient heroes. The symbol of Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, became a rallying cry in later centuries. During Mexico's 19th century fight for independence, indigenous identity was reclaimed as a source of pride. Revolutionary leaders evoked the glory of Tenochtitlan. In murals, songs, and textbooks, the Aztec past was reborn, not as a lost world, but as the foundation of modern Mexican identity. This process of cultural reclamation continued into the 20th century. Artists like Diego Rivera painted vast murals celebrating the Aztecs. Writers composed epic poems in Nahuatl. Universities studied ancient manuscripts, and everyday citizens honored their ancestry through dress, cuisine, music, and story. Today, millions of people in Mexico and beyond identify with Aztec heritage. Nahuatl is still spoken in hundreds of communities. The eagle and cactus, the founding symbol of Tenochtitlan, flies at the center of the Mexican flag. The chinampas of Xochimilco still produce maize and flowers, and the rhythms of ancient drums can still be heard at festivals, at protests, and on the streets of Mexico City. The Aztecs may have lost their empire, but they never lost their soul. Their philosophy, language, art, and spirit continue to shape lives. In markets, in lullabies, in the scent of copal incense, in the swirl of a dancer's skirt. There, the empire lives on, not in conquest, but in memory, not in temples, but in hearts, not in domination, but in resilience. Time has flowed like water over the lake where once rose the temples of Tenochtitlan. Stone by stone, the city was buried, remade, forgotten, and rediscovered. Yet even now, beneath the pavement of modern Mexico City, the Aztec world stirs. Every excavation uncovers a statue, a glyph, a shard of pottery, whispering of gods and empires. Every word spoken in Nahuatl echoes with the voices of those who came before. The Aztec Empire, in its time, was one of the most complex, sophisticated, and deeply spiritual civilizations the world has ever known. Its people charted the stars, wove poetry into politics, and walked with reverence through a world alive with gods. They lived with discipline and purpose, guided by a worldview that saw the universe as a sacred cycle of giving and receiving, of sacrifice and renewal. Their downfall was brutal. Their city, once the jewel of the lake, became a ruin. Their temples were toppled, their gods condemned, their names replaced in colonial tongues. But their memory endured, first in the silence of survivors, then in the resilience of descendants, and finally in the recognition of a nation reawakening to its roots. Today, we walk streets built on ancient foundations. We see their symbols on flags and coins. We speak their words: chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote, unaware of the origins. Their cosmology, art, architecture, and philosophy are no longer hidden in codices, but taught, performed, celebrated. What was once erased is now engraved anew. The Aztecs understood that time was cyclical, that every destruction gave birth to creation, that death was not an end, but a doorway. Perhaps that is why their legacy feels so alive. Perhaps that is why their stories still move us. not because of their fall, but because of how fiercely they lived, how deeply they believed, and how beautifully they saw the world. To speak of the Aztecs is to speak of duality, of war and song, of fire and water, of light and shadow. It is to enter a world where gods walked among humans, where hearts beat not only for love or life, but for the sun itself. It is to remember that empire is not only power, but responsibility. That memory is not static, but sacred. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the story settle gently in your mind, not as a tale of conquest, but as a tribute to endurance. Picture the canals of Tenochtitlan glistening in the moonlight. Hear the distant sound of a drum. Smell the warmth of burning copal. Feel the pulse of a people who, though silenced, were never truly still. The Aztecs are gone, but not lost. They live in the land, in the language, in the lineage of millions. And now, they live in you. Good night.